with more. For generations, politicians have desperately tried to go out and sell their great vision of society, and stubbornly people have kept voting for more stuff. And this needs to be the first generation that tries to grapple with the idea of how we get people to vote for less stuff. Rationing might be one way of doing it in policy terms, might be the kind of word that would kill off the idea in terms of public popularity. So that's a really long way of saying I don't know. Sorry.
Well, I think actually it's a really good question, and probably my answer is actually not that far away from what Patrick's just said. In that I think, as a matter of principle, there is an idea here that most people would agree with. I think the difficulty becomes when you try to implement anything like this in practice. I mean, to give you an example, how do you avoid a situation where people who are on low incomes find themselves rationed to a greater extent than those who can afford to spend more money, or in any sort of system where you have rationing, even so like if you take the renewables obligations certificate, which was set up by the government to encourage renewable energy, that of course is a tradable asset, and therefore companies can buy and sell renewable obligation certificates. I think it would be virtually impossible to develop an instance of rationing that you couldn't trade in the ration.
Sure.
And therefore, do you not create a situation where better off people just say, well, fine, we'll just buy more vouchers, and the less well off are the ones who end up suffering. So there's lots of issues there I think have to be grappled with. So there's a principle, I think, is something that definitely needs to be considered.
I think that's really important to try and make sure that social justice and equity don't get lost in this debate. But if you've got a tradable quota, then that is a way of I'm not sure if this is the right phrase to use either, but redistributing wealth. Because if wealthy people want to consume more and have a bigger carbon footprint, they have to pay poor people for the privilege. And that doesn't abandon the idea that there will be rich people and poor people in the world, and that's not fair. But it does at least mean that there's some kind of recompense to people who are not emitting the same levels of CO2 in their lifestyles.
Okay. I wonder if Patrick genuinely believes that this energy gap that you were referring to, could it be filled without constructing new nuclear power plants?
Yes. I don't like the term energy gap. Energy gap as a concept seems to imply that we have to accept the idea that we just consume more this year than we did last year, consume more next year than we do this year, consume more and more and more and more. Ultimately, if we put every tool in the box in play here, if we exploit to the full every technology to generate electricity that we possibly can, and we are principally talking here about electricity, but it applies to energy more generally as well. If we do everything that we can, find every source, and we still keep consuming more and more and more and more and more, it won't be enough, and we'll end up with a concept like an energy gap. The first thing that we have to do is consume less. And that doesn't just mean energy efficiency, because a whole range of different technologies that we use in our lives have become more efficient, dramatically more efficient over the decades. But our consumption is still going up because we're using them more. The motor car is a perfect example. The amount of CO2 emissions, the energy input that we've been using in the motor car, the private car, has gone up dramatically despite huge increases in energy efficiency of the vehicles themselves. And the same thing is true of planes. The airplane manufacturers say, don't worry about flying less, we'll make more efficient planes. Yes, they will make more efficient planes, and it won't make the damn bit of difference, because if we're flying more, we'll still be consuming more and burning more of the fuel. If we want to do away with the concept of an energy gap, we need to consume less, first of all. And the second aspect of it is where do we get the energy from that we're using. And I don't accept the idea that even wind, even onshore wind, can't provide base load. I think we simply haven't figured out a way yet. Well, we haven't put it into practice, figured out a way to make it practical. But if you use the energy that you're generating from wind at times in the day when there's a low demand, or times in the year when there's low demand, and you use that on site in almost the same way that we use pumped hydro. I mean, hydro can provide a base load because when the demand is low, you're pumping water up the hill, and when you decide that the the demand is going up and your supply isn't there, you open the hatch, down it comes, and you've got a steady, reliable, controllable supply. You can use exactly the same thing if we figure out how to make that practical under the ground in terms of compressed air storage of energy. Use the wind energy that you're generating, store that energy on site, and then release it as and when needed. But also, again, I come down to the issue of wasting less, because if we're shortening the distribution lines, if we're moving away from systems technologies which inherently waste lots of heat energy, then we're helping to close that gap as well, or abolish the concept of the energy gap.
But the government doesn't seem to be assessing that problem.
No, the government wants to build some nuclear power stations.
Every system's just wasting huge amounts of energy in everything they do in their lives, and the government doesn't seem to be. Why can't they pass legislation to enforce efficiency?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. One thing I think we have to do is look at, for example, something as simple as building standards, to say, why do we have such slack building standards that don't insist people on new build properties, whether it's domestic or commercial, on much higher standards of insulation to reduce energy demand, and I think something will be real. Yeah. But I would like to say a word about the energy gap issue. Just going back to the figures I quoted for 2005, electricity generation in Scotland, 48% from fossil fuels, 38% from nuclear, and 14% roughly from renewables. See, what confuses me about Patrick's position was, if I were a Green politician looking at that mix, I would say the priority would be to reduce the 48% fossil fuels, not to get rid of the 38% nuclear. And I think that's where I have a difficulty. If you're increasing renewable capacity, which we're doing, that should be done at the expense of the conventional generation, the fossil fuel burning generation. Surely nuclear, which by any standards produces much less CO2 than conventional fuels, is better having a nuclear component than a fossil fuel burning component. Surely we should be focusing on reducing the 48% of electricity generation that's currently driven by fossil fuels.
I think we absolutely need to reduce that consumption of fossil fuels, but where, not without ruling out the possibility that carbon capture and storage might become viable in future. That's a way of using fossil fuels which wouldn't involve large amounts of CO2 emissions. But I come down to this assumption that Murdo keeps talking about, that nuclear is a close to zero carbon technology. It really depends how you cut it. At the moment, you can make an assessment of where we stand in terms of the CO2, the indirect CO2 emissions that come from nuclear. Different studies have shown that, come up with a different figure, and you can play with the statistics. Some of them say that it's I think Murdo said it's 50% more than wind.
Well, with respect, that was Greenpeace, who are an anti-nuclear organisation. So it was 50% higher than wind.
I certainly commend Greenpeace for their impartiality in the way they commission themselves. Other studies have shown that it's closer to the equivalent of a modern gas-fired power station. One thing that we do know in the long run, not just about what's happening now, one thing that we know about what will change in the future if we do continue for the next few decades. That's what this is about. Get a new nuclear power station in place in a couple of decades, and you've got a few more decades after that of its operational life. So you're talking about 50 years of continued consumption, increased consumption around the world. You are talking about those dirtier sources of nuclear fuels which involve much higher energy input to turn them into usable fuel and get energy out, and that means higher CO2 emissions. So that the difference there that you're pointing out between fossil fuels and nuclear will close. That gap will close between the impact, the CO2 impact of the two of them. And the only long-term sustainable, and let's forget the idea that sustainable is just a bit of jargon that everybody throws around nowadays. Sustainable means you can keep on doing it. Unsustainable means you can't. You come up against physical limits. If we commit to an unsustainable, fundamentally unsustainable energy source, which is about digging up a rare element from the ground, from wherever we can find it, ultimately we run out of this stuff. Ultimately we come up against physical limits, and we cannot think of this as part of the long-term energy mix of the future.
Yeah,